Hello, welcome everybody. Please mute yourselves. Just letting everybody in and we'll get started in a second. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know a lot of you have come just off our 2 weeks of our Palestine campaign and 2 weeks of our China campaign. So we planned this webinar to help better connect the dots between the two, as you know, the war against imperialism is being fought on every front all over the world, even domestically here in the United States. We are joined today by the brilliant Charles Xu from the Qiao Collective to discuss the deep-rooted solidarity between China and Palestine, tracing how their struggles have long been intertwined in the fight against imperialism. So Charles is going to unpack how China has throughout the years offered political, material, ideological support for Palestinian liberation, and how this relationship was built on shared revolutionary principles of two people resisting foreign domination and occupation. And this conversation takes place, of course, in today's very urgent context, the ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people carried out with US weapons and funding alongside Washington's escalating push for war on China. So both Palestine and China face the full weight of US imperialism. Palestine through occupation and ethnic cleansing, and China through economic warfare, military encirclement, and an unrelenting propaganda campaign. So by examining the history in the present of China-Palestine solidarity, Charles will challenge these false narratives used to divide the struggles and show how their unity points toward this global, broader front against imperialism that refuses ultimately to be complicit in genocide, resists all the drives to war, and works towards a shared future of humanity built on sovereignty, dignity, and peace for all people. So we will begin with a presentation by Charles centered around the very brilliant article he wrote called "The Gates of the Great Continent, Palestine, China, and the War for Humanity's Future." And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend that you do. The link will be in the chat. And then after that, we will move into some questions, some from me and some from the audience. So if you have any while Charles is speaking, please drop them in the chat and we will get to as many as possible. So with that, I welcome Charles to take over. Thank you so much again for joining us tonight. We are so excited to talk to you.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much for that really warm intro, Megan. And thanks to you, Jody, and the entire CODEPINK team for warmly inviting me and for organizing this event. Yeah, and thanks to everyone for joining the conversation today. I have some slides, so let me go ahead and share those. All right. Perfect. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so yeah, as Megan noted, yesterday marked the second anniversary of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. And with that, we commemorate 2 years, not just of genocide, but also of resistance, which I think we really need to bear in mind, and which is going to be a major focus of this presentation today. Let's see. Yeah, so as Megan mentioned, a lot of this is going to be adapted from or reworked from an article that I wrote for Qiao Collective all the way back in the 6th month or so of the genocide in March 2024. Obviously, a lot has happened since then, but I think a lot of the analysis does continue to hold true. So there's going to be some material from that article in this talk, some new material as well to bring us to the current conjuncture. And I should mention as well that that's not the only thing that we at Qiao Collective have published on Palestine. Last November, actually, after the martyrdom of the then leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, um, we noted that there was sort of an outpouring of popular sympathy and actually a lot of quite profound political analysis on the Chinese internet that was, um, not really getting communicated to Western audiences. So we translated what we thought was one of the best pieces, a video essay on Bilibili called "Shattering the Iron Wall." This is a piece of original art that another of my comrades made for it. Highly recommend that people check that out as well, and I'll be referencing it in the talk as well. Yeah, so I covered a lot of ground in the article. I can't really recapitulate all of it in this talk, but I do want to draw out one particular strand that I think doesn't really get talked about as much. We hear a lot about bilateral sort of state to state relations between China and Palestine, some of the history as well going on at the official level, the governmental level. But there's also a vein of popular solidarity, which I really want to bring out in my article and which has continued to the present day. And I think that we really need to properly understand, the response from ordinary Chinese people to, both the heroic resistance displayed by the people in Gaza as well as the genocide they're enduring as part of this international popular cradle of the resistance. So, yes, just to situate us, here's a quote that many of you may have seen. It opens my article. This is from Chairman Mao to a visiting delegation of the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1965, where he drew a direct link between, these two struggles for national liberation and the imperialist strategy of siege and of occupation that they both confronted. He said imperialism is afraid of China and of the Arabs. Israel and Taiwan are bases of imperialism in Asia. You are the gate of the great continent, and we are the rear. So that really was a sort of a profound basis of the solidarity that was shown at the official level, and it was very much reciprocated as well. Yasser Arafat, who was a longtime leader of the PLO, including in its armed struggle phase, said that China is the biggest influence in supporting our revolution and strengthening its perseverance. Here's a photo of him with the premier of China, Zhou Enlai. George Habash, the leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, said, "Our best friend is China." Um, you know, at the time, he said China wants Israel erased from the map because as long as Israel exists, there will remain an aggressive imperialist outpost on Arab soil. Of course, this is no longer the official position of China, and I'll get into sort of some of the complicated reasons for that later because it does have to be openly acknowledged. But at the sort of apex of the high tide of national liberation globally, China's relations with the PLO were very strong. It was the first non-Arab country to recognize it. It was the exclusive arms supplier for the Palestinian resistance among all of the great powers until 1970, when the Soviets started jumping in as well. China also offered military and ideological training for the PLO based on its own experience of People's War against both foreign Japanese invasion and domestic reaction. And, at a popular level, this expressed itself as well with mass rallies every Nakba Day, every May 15th, which was called Palestine Solidarity Day. So here is one of those rallies. Here is another that greeted, one of the earliest PLO officials to visit China. And a lot of you may be familiar with Qassam Kanafani, the Palestinian revolutionary writer, novelist, and militant of the PFLP. Something that I discovered in the course of researching my article is that Kanafani, in fact, visited China not once but twice. and he wrote, what seems to be based on the Arabic reviews that I had to read in machine translation, unfortunately, a very interesting travelogue about his time there, which I would love to see translated. Here are some photos of him on the Great Wall. And so that was from his visit in 1965. In 1966, he participated in the Afro-Asian Writers Conference, which was hosted in Beijing. These are some commemorative stamps for it on the left. Um, and here's a really sort of moving episode that's related in this article by Suleiman Hodali, where um, you know he was so overcome by emotion upon seeing the visible evidence, the shrapnel from the remains of a U.S. plane shot down in Vietnam, that he was sort of momentarily unable to speak, right? And Beijing, at the time was the site for this kind of direct convergence between Palestinian and Vietnamese revolutionaries. Another example of this, Kanafani was deeply involved as well as a point of contact between the PFLP and the Japanese Red Army, which was a Japanese Neo Left formation that actually left Japan in the early 1970s and relocated to Lebanon, where it fought directly side by side with the PFLP against the Zionist occupation. So you see Kanafani here with Fusako Shigenobu, the leader of the JRA. And of course, on the wall behind them, you can see the direct inspiration that they drew from the revolutionary centers, east and west in China and Cuba. Another story in terms of this direct red thread between, China's solidarity with Palestine at the popular level during the Mao period and today is the very interesting biography of this figure, Zhang Chengzhi. He was born to a Hui Muslim family, albeit a secular one. In 1966, at the very start of the Cultural Revolution, he became the very first self-styled Red Guard. So, as you may know, that was sort of a militant youth movement that wound up taking the country by storm. And so he was the first of millions, perhaps tens of millions, who adopted that label. But unlike many of the others after the Cultural Revolution, he never renounced the Red Guard spirit, especially the spirit of internationalism. And he carried that with him when he actually, converted to Sufi Islam in the late 80s. And for him, solidarity with Palestine was very much a through line for that. So, in 2012, he, visited Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan to fundraise and also to express his solidarity directly. I'm just going to put up here some quotes of his, which I think were quite prescient. This was from all the way back in 2014 in Israel's previous largest scale war on Gaza before Al-Aqsa flood, where this is translated from the Chinese, but he is sort of directly comparing Palestinian resistance fighters, in particular Hamas, to the Jewish guerrilla fighters who resisted Nazi occupation in the Warsaw Ghetto. That was a comparison that a lot of people have gotten in trouble for making, certainly since October 7th. Rifat al-Arir, was martyred for making that comparison among others by Israel. But here was Zhang Chengzhi making that comparison all the way back in 2014. He also was very inspired by the story of the Japanese Red Army. And he wrote that, in fact, in the act of, of joining the Palestinian cause in militant solidarity and taking up arms for the cause of Palestine, what they had in fact done was completely defy, Japan's colonial history in the 20th century, of which China was among the foremost victims. And he said that, by throwing themselves into the Arab world, that, the Japanese Red Army had thrown themselves into the embrace of Mother Asia and turned against this path of European-inspired colonialism. And then, this was a statement of his that came out after my original article, because that article came out before the student intifada here in the United States last year. And, when that kicked off at Columbia, in late April, Zhang Chenzhi actually put up a statement of solidarity on WeChat, um, which I think is quite moving. He said, perhaps there's profound meaning in Mao Zedong's words that we place great hopes on the American people. In the United States, the great tradition of student activism remains unbroken. And he concluded by saying that what is happening at Columbia University is a revolution. It may retreat to a low ebb, but it may also overturn the world. And that was just one example of really, I think, like a veritable flood of express online solidarity with the U.S. solidarity movement when it, reached what I think was its peak in terms of, militancy, in terms of the mass nature of the struggle, in terms of global visibility, which was the student intifada of last spring. That happened to coincide with the anniversary, the 95th, or sorry, the 105th anniversary of the May 4th movement in China, which had really kicked off the process that led to the foundation of the Communist Party. And a lot of Chinese netizens were drawing this direct comparison between the two sort of world historic student mobilizations based on that coincidence. Some other examples of Chinese sort of popular embrace of the US-based solidarity movement, in spite of all of the, like geopolitical tensions of the new Cold War that the US is levying against China. A huge sort of embrace on the Chinese internet as well. Lots of art produced in honor of Aaron Bushnell when he self-immolated and joined the ranks of Martyrs for Palestine last spring. And then in terms of their engagement with the Palestinian resistance itself on the ground, this has been a constant through line in Chinese popular discourse as well. A lot of you maybe following the work of John Elmer on the Electronic Intifada, where he breaks down resistance news every week, every Thursday. If you're not following him, I absolutely recommend that you do so. Another thing I discovered in the course of researching my article is that there is a Chinese equivalent of him on Bilibili, who goes by the moniker Hei Mao Xingxiu, or Black Cat Planet, and he pretty much does the same thing except in Chinese. So you see a screenshot of that on the left, and then this really goes to the level of not just observation from afar, but direct connection at the popular level with China's own revolutionary history, where we've seen, a lot of renewed interest as a result of the strengthening of socialist education there, as a result of, the new Cold War, right? And so this sort of takes me back to this translation that we published last November, Shattering the Iron Wall. And here's, I think, a very apposite quote from that, where the sort of Bilibili analyst who narrated the original video said, of course, this is in translation, today many scholars criticize Hamas's resistance strategy, asserting that Hamas's violent attack on Israel is what led to the present tragedy. All I can say is these scholars are either malicious or full-blown idiots. As one of the greatest historical victims of nonviolent resistance, somehow there are Chinese people who still believe that non-resistance can be exchanged for peace. And then going into more detail about this really frustrating strategy of attempted collaboration with Japan, of sort of turning, the guns of the Republic of China government against the communists instead of the Japanese invaders, that, really defined a lot of the 30s and, really up until the full-blown invasion of China by Japan in 1937. So, a lot of people making that direct comparison. And, as I mentioned, this particular translation is mostly about Yahya Sinwar. One comparison that a lot of Chinese netizens were drawing after his martyrdom, which I think is quite moving, was with one of China's own popular heroes from the anti-Japanese struggle, Yang Jingyu, who was a commander of the Northeast anti-Japanese United Army. He was, martyred in battle with Japan in, I believe, 1936, after, a last stand that, reminded a lot of people of the way that Yahya Sinwar was martyred, sort of facing off alone but unbowed against this colonial occupier. And then, there's another sort of really haunting parallel as well, which a lot of Chinese netizens noted, which is that, after he was killed, the Imperial Japanese Army actually did an autopsy on Yang Jingyu, and they found that for days beforehand, he had been subsisting on nothing but grass and tree bark. That was all that they found in his stomach. And of course, the Israelis, did the same thing with Yahya Sinwar and affirmed that, much like the rest of his people in the trenches, he also had really not eaten anything in the days before his martyrdom. So, a lot of profound parallels being drawn there between these twin national liberation struggles at the popular level, right, between China and Palestine. I think it has to be acknowledged for a lot of people, this, you know, like these statements seem to be a lot, uh, more militant, a lot stronger in a way than what they're hearing from the Chinese government per se. Um, and a lot of people ask why, and so I think it is important to directly address that question by actually historicizing, the respective paths of Palestine and of the People's Republic of China to statehood, to sovereignty, to international recognition, and the fact that despite all of these parallels in terms of the kind of struggle on the ground, that has to this day, allowed for the survival of the Palestinian people on their land, right? For their steadfastness, their sumud, their resistance. There are some really distinct differences in terms of the actual meaning of statehood and independence. And that has a lot of repercussions when it comes to, bilateral relations, diplomacy, right? And the way that China today relates with the Palestinian cause. So, um, to start with the parallels that are there, right? You have this tactical parallel on the ground, or this tactical and strategic parallel of executing a strategy of people's war, right? Embedded with the people, as what the Palestinians call the popular cradle of the resistance. And you've also had this historical diffusion of certain particular tactics, like, for example, tunnel warfare, from originally, as you can see on the left, uh, China's war of resistance against Japan, through to Korea's war of resistance against the U.S., Vietnam's war of resistance, and from there, that tactic being brought to Hezbollah in Lebanon and its successful liberation of the South from Israel in 2000, right? And from there to Gaza, right, where the Palestinian resistance today continues to hold out in this vast tunnel network, and enable it's truly astounding feats of resistance against the Israeli occupier both above and below ground. Another parallel is the fact of indigenous arms production. This is something that, of course, we see today in China, you know, in its most sort of high-tech form, right? As we saw very recently during this military parade in Beijing to mark the 80th anniversary of victory over Japan. But it has an echo, throughout all of West Asia, and throughout the axis of resistance, which is supporting the Palestinian struggle. You see it in Japan, which successfully held off the surprise Israeli attack and humbled its air defenses. Its and the U.S.'s air defenses in the 12-day war in June. You see it in Yemen, where you can see some of these missiles on the left. They're homegrown missiles. They've continued firing into occupied Palestine in solidarity with Gaza. And you see it in Gaza itself, where their weapons are homegrown. A lot of them are made very ingeniously with unexploded Israeli ordnance, and this is part of the reason why it's so ridiculous to demand that the resistance in Gaza disarm, as a condition for the end of the genocide, because that is quite literally impossible when, even under blockade and genocide, they're able to produce it themselves with their own means. But now I want to get to some of the differences. And, there's this really critical 2 year span of 1948 to 1949 where, um, you know, uh, I think a lot of these divergences, right, between the Palestinian and Chinese liberation struggles begin. And these are going to have a lot of repercussions because it was during this period that the Communist Party of China, in the last years of the revolution, in the series of lightning offensives, like really consolidated territorial unity, right, with the exception of Taiwan, but pretty much actually exercising territorial sovereignty and liberating all of mainland China from imperialist domination for the first time in over a century. But at pretty much the same time in Palestine, what you had was, this UN-backed partition plan, which was then, further violated by the new Israeli state in the Nakba of 1948, a total sort of loss of territorial sovereignty over first 78% of historic Palestine, and then after the 1967 war, pretty much all of it. With like just a smattering of sort of non-contiguous areas of really kind of encircled and besieged Palestinian land left in the West Bank, and of course Gaza as well, suffering under this nearly 2 decade blockade and now 2 years of intensified genocide. Um, you have at a formal level between the two struggles also a struggle for international recognition of their legitimacy. And in both cases, the United Nations, for all its issues, was kind of the main venue or forum uh, for that struggle, right? At least in the diplomatic arena. These two photos, the one on the left is Chinese diplomat Wu Xiuquan, who actually spoke at the UN Security Council in 1950, despite the fact that at that time and actually for another 21 years, because of U.S. pressure, China's seat at the UN was actually held by the Chiang Kai-shek nationalist regime in Taiwan. And furthermore, this was a few months into the Korean War, where nominally under the UN banner, you had U.S. troops invading the Korean Peninsula to prevent its sort of socialist liberation and reunification. China, of course, intervened on the side of Korean sovereignty in this war, and so very much what you had on the left in this photo from 1950 was China sort of banging at the gates of the UN, right? But from the outside, and it wasn't until 1971, which you see on the left, that there was enough of a global majority, thanks to African decolonization, thanks to the entry of all these new countries in the global South, for China, the People's Republic of China, to take its rightful place. On the other hand, the significance of the UN has not been, symbolically, right, has not been lost on the Palestinian people either. That was why it marked such a landmark when in 1974, the PLO was acknowledged first by the Arab League and then by the UN General Assembly as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And when Yasser Arafat was invited to actually address the UN General Assembly in his famous, speech about, the olive branch and the gun, right? That's what you see on the left. But this sort of fixation on the UN and on formal recognition, sort of as almost like a substitute, right, for actual territorial sovereignty, is what led to the really sordid spectacle at the most recent UN General Assembly just concluded of, the US abusing its privileges as the host nation to deny visas to the entire Palestinian delegation, even though it's led by this Zionist collaborator, Mahmoud Abbas, right? Formal president of Palestine, formal head of the Palestinian Authority. Even his visa was denied, and so when he addressed the assembly, he had to do so by video link. Um, so that marks a real distinction, and at the heart of it, right, is that as a condition of full integration into the world order, uh, both China and Palestine, as sort of formal state entities, did have to normalize, with the imperialist great powers at whose hands they had suffered. Um, but in China's case, but this really was, it could be legitimately considered a diplomatic coup, right? And an affirmation of the PRC's sovereignty over mainland China. So, for example, what you see on the left here is in 1972, the visit by Japan's then Prime Minister to China, greeted by Zhou Enlai, where the PRC normalized relations with Japan. Um, uh, and that was, just was it? Yeah, 27 years, right, after the conclusion of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Likewise, in 1979, you had full rapprochement and then normalization of ties with the United States. Again, capping off this trajectory towards full integration into the world system as an actual sovereign country, rooted in territorial control of its own land. And I think that, even though you can sort of draw an analogy and at a formal level diplomatically, I feel like in some ways the Chinese government probably does, right? With what happened in 1993 with the Oslo Accords, um, where the PLO again, still at the time and still now formally considered the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Um, normalized relations with Israel and extended unreciprocated recognition to Israel. But in so doing, gave up claims to 78% of historic Palestine in exchange for the vague promise of a two-state solution that, of course, has been systematically undermined by the Zionist entity at every stage since. So, I think these two paths towards normalization, towards a kind of formal statehood, really lie at the root of the quandaries and the contradictions in what we think of as Palestinian statehood today. And whoops, yeah, I guess that's sort of the point that I was trying to make here as well, right? Was the declaration of the People's Republic of China in 1949 was backed up by a social revolution and by the concrete exercise of territorial sovereignty over almost all of Chinese territory. Whereas the Palestinian Declaration of Independence, the formation of a formal Palestinian state in 1988, actually marked a retreat, from the positions of the PLO, its original aim of liberating all of historic Palestine, and it sort of paved the way for Oslo, and then for the surrender of more and more, even nominal territorial claims. So, what that means is that in a way that probably seems paradoxical and frustrating to a lot of people, it is the case that at the governmental level today, China, along with most of the rest of the world and increasingly the West, right, as we saw with this wave of 10 new recognitions of the state of Palestine, formal recognitions, they embrace some like a chimera called the two-state solution, right? Um, and I think understandably this can be a source of a lot of frustration, right? When you have not just China, but even I would say more overtly vocal diplomatic allies of the Palestinian cause, like South Africa, like Colombia, right? Even nonetheless formally affirming for diplomatic purposes their commitment to a two-state solution because that is the formal position of the actually existing state of Palestine, right? Um, but I think we have to distinguish between what China and most of the rest of the global South means when they say a two-state solution, right? When they are talking about an independent state of Palestine versus the like really kind of insulting and impractical conditions that, these most recent 10 Western states attached to their formal declaration of recognition for the state of Palestine, where they said it has to be demilitarized. It cannot press for the right of return to 48 Palestine. It's conditioned on the disarmament of Hamas and of the entire Palestinian resistance. That is a framework that China, to this day rejects, right? Um, when it's referring to, two-state solution, um, you know, that's still something that has its limitations, right? It's grounded in these diplomatic constraints. But the Palestinian state that China envisions is one that has actual territorial sovereignty, that has the right to armed self-defense, and that actually includes the full range of Palestinian political forces, including those in the resistance. So I want to go into sort of the manifestations of that we've seen over the last 2 years, and then conclude. To start off with, you know, Hamas, right, as well as pretty much every other armed group in the Palestinian resistance, every member of the rejectionist front that did not accept the capitulation of Oslo, um, they are all officially, uh, proscribed and illegalized in the West, pretty much across the West, and its various vassals as so-called terrorist organizations. This is something that China has never done, and in fact, as we see, it has maintained direct diplomatic engagement with Hamas. You have this photo here of a Chinese diplomat with the martyred leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, where he, quote, confirmed that the Hamas movement is part of the Palestinian national fabric, and China is keen on maintaining a relationship with it. You've also had quite recently, as recently as last spring, China affirming, the legitimacy of the Palestinian right to national liberation through armed struggle. I'm not sure if the audio for this is going to come through, but okay, maybe not.
Mhm.
But anyway, this is a speech. This is an intervention by Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Ma Xinmin at the International Court of Justice last spring, where he affirmed that the use of force in the cause of national liberation is an inalienable right protected by international law and cannot be equated with terrorism. That obviously is not something that you're going to hear from any Western diplomat. And in fact, the whole this whole facade of recognizing the state of Palestine formally is premised on the rejection of that right, even though it is enshrined in international law. And then to sort of put more meat on the bones of this commitment to national liberation, China, from its own experience, knows that in many ways a precondition for national liberation against a colonial oppressor is to achieve national unity internally, right? Not necessarily agreement on all the issues, but at least unity in action. And that has actually been a through line of its engagement with all Palestinian factions from, the early Mao period to today. And this really is the basis, right, for the Beijing Declaration of July 2024, when it brought together 14 different Palestinian factions in Beijing to unite around a national consensus, and to chart out at least the basic principles, across the divide between Fatah and Hamas and the other factions, for a unified struggle for national liberation. And, that in some ways prefigures, the really expansive and inclusive democratic polity that China wants to see in an independent Palestinian state that could serve as a stepping stone to the full liberation of historic Palestine, and that the West absolutely wants to rule out. So that pretty much takes us, I think, to the current conjuncture today, where you know um, we hear all this talk about Trump's 20-point so-called peace plan. We hear all this information coming out about how negotiations are going on in Cairo. Obviously, developments are coming in very quickly, minute by minute. But in terms of the fundamental principles of Palestinians governing Palestine, of actual territorial sovereignty, of the right to resistance and to armed self-defense, these have been a constant in China's engagement, even at the official level with Palestine. It's marked a clear distinction with the Western approach. And, if there's one takeaway from this talk that I want to communicate, is the fact that, not just at the state level, but even more strongly at the level of the people, it is deeply grounded in China's own history of resistance and liberation. So with that, I want to thank you and yeah, invite any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Charles. Incredible presentation. I think there's a lot of information in here that a lot of people don't know that I think is really, really important. So I really appreciate you writing this article and doing all this research and coming here to speak to us about it today. So thank you. For anybody who has any questions, drop them in the chat. I have a lot. There's so much we can talk about. So I'll kick us off with a couple questions. I want to take us back first, because we're currently coming off both the 2-year anniversary of the start of the genocide in Gaza, as well as the 80th anniversary of the end of war against fascism, World War II, where China, faced costs much higher than a lot of Western countries, something that has been systematically erased from our education. And you wrote that China was back then the epicenter of the world's anti-fascist struggle. And today you say Gaza now holds this position. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit more to that parallel, especially for people who may not know much about about the larger role that China played in the war against fascism.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, Megan. I think that uh, both of those points actually, on China as a focal point for anti-fascist resistance, um, even before what most people in the West think of at the start of World War II, which they date to the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939. China was on the front lines, of the struggle against Japanese fascism, really from the first invasion of Chinese territory in the Northeast, 1931 onwards. Um, and this is something that was by and large embraced, at least as far as like the Asia Pacific sphere or theater of what became World War II, by the West during the war, right? When it was very palatable to embrace China's nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek. But really, from the revolution, from the victory of the communists in 1949, the formation of the People's Republic onwards, it's something that's been systematically ignored and downplayed and devalued in the Western imaginary, in favor of a narrative where the U.S. Where the West, right, the Western colonial powers, which is what they were in Asia, and the U.S. in particular, were somehow the leading forces in the defeat of Japan, and then of course this is a narrative that they also recapitulate in the European theater, where they take just as undue a share of the credit for the defeat of Nazi Germany, even though it was, of course, the Soviet Union in its great patriotic war that really did the heavy lifting and that sacrificed the most, right? I know actually that the Tricontinental is going to be dropping a very detailed dossier about this, which Jody kind of teased at in an earlier talk, a few weeks ago, and which I'm very excited for. Really backing this up with a truly exhaustive amount of quantitative evidence. But when it comes down to it, right, like where these narratives are coming from is like total historical revisionism by the West, and a real like dilution of what fascism means, right? Which really they have to do in order to justify the fact that immediately after the end of World War II, um, what the Western powers led by the U.S. did is they essentially let not just most Nazis in Germany off the hook entirely, right? In the service of incorporating West Germany into NATO and into the anti-communist project there, right? At the front lines of the Cold War. But they rehabilitated Japanese fascism, perhaps even more egregiously, by leaving Hirohito in power, by exonerating, the commanders of the infamous Unit 731 Human Experimentation Center in Northeast China, right? And really restoring the Japanese far right to a position of hegemony that has been almost unbroken, since the 50s, in order to consolidate Japan's position on the front lines of the anti-communist um, war against all these Asian national liberation struggles. And so, you know, really, I think there's a direct line that we can draw between, that sort of partial rehabilitation of the Western colonial project and of the Japanese fascist and German fascist colonial projects, right? Even if they won't say that outright, and the wholesale embrace of the genocidal Zionist project. I think this is clearest in terms of the like really psychotic degree of support, offered by today's unified Germany, right? To Israel, which at an official level, until very recently, I would say, and in terms of the degree of domestic repression, has even been more unhinged than the United States in some ways. Um, but in every case, right, the common thread that you see is that you have during the Cold War, Japan in the East, Germany in the West as front lines in the struggle against communism, and today, Israel as this settler colony implanted in historic Palestine is at the front lines of the imperialist project in West Asia, as it always has been, but now that is the focal point of resistance to it, especially since October 7th. And I think that for that reason, the Palestinian resistance, aided by the broader regional axis of resistance, has to be seen as really sitting at the focal point of a broader anti-fascist struggle today, and it has to be central to any anti-fascist project.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Jody has her hand up. Jody, do you have a question?
Thanks, Megan. Charles, that was amazing. Thank you so much. One of the things that comes up a lot for us here has been, why doesn't China, go and save Palestine? And you talked about the positioning and everything, but here we are with the United States breathing down, really desiring to go to war on China with any misstep. And how would you answer that question if it comes to you?
Yeah, I guess I want to sort of start off by saying that I think that the vast majority of people who ask that question in the Palestine Solidarity movement do so in good faith. And it comes from a genuine position of wanting to impute right to any sort of anti-hegemonic force in the world, the same like urgency, right? The same, I guess, willingness to sacrifice for this cause that so many of us in these popular movements do. And so it's coming from a good place. And I guess what I would say is that if we take as our reference point the actually existing Palestinian resistance, right? There is a reason why pretty much all factions of it did gather in Beijing, last summer, and why they sort of continue to trust in Beijing as an interlocutor, right? Despite the fact that, yes, China does maintain diplomatic ties to Israel. It hasn't fully cut off trade with Israel, which in fact, unfortunately is the case for the vast majority of the global South, right? Like the fact of, for example, Colombia cutting off coal exports is one of very few exceptions to that, even among countries that have, for example, overtly signed on to South Africa's genocide case against Israel at the ICJ, right? South Africa itself hasn't done so, and what I think is really needed is popular pressure through whatever channels are appropriate, right? In each of these respective governments to do, in each of these respective countries for their governments to do more, and yeah, I understand certainly the impulse, right, to say that China today is like a very sort of like solid and powerful and anti-hegemonic force, and in principle it has the capacity to do more, right? But at the same time, I think a lot of the impulse, right, to openly criticize, for example, the Chinese government for not doing more, is coming from a place of frustration, at how few levers of democratic control, right, or even effective popular pressure we have on, our own governments who are actually directly funding and arming, the genocide and the Zionist war machine to do more. And what I would encourage is sort of more engagement, more understanding of and more engagement of where the Chinese people, where Chinese civil society is at, which has always been in a more advanced position on this issue, right? Than I think has been true for most of the West, and which as I mentioned in my talk, has very much embraced all manifestations of the solidarity movement, including in the West, right? And yeah, I guess the last thing is to bear in mind the fact that while it certainly is strong enough at the moment to dissuade direct military attack by the imperialist West, China remains a target of encirclement, of attempted at least partial blockade, right? It remains a target of these projects of economic underdevelopment. And there is an increasing tendency, I think, in the West, for the Palestine solidarity movement actually to be used as a vehicle for those kinds of xenophobic narratives and, allegations of undue Chinese political influence. And so I think we need to be on the lookout for those narratives, but also to realize where their power derives, right? From the understanding that even if this drive towards a multipolar world is proceeding at a pace that may be frustratingly slow for people, what it's doing is inexorably, it is weakening the imperialist hegemony of the US. And that is ultimately, what the power behind, the power that is buttressing the Zionist genocide in Gaza.
Thank you. I mean, what you just said really is like it's moving in the same direction as all of our actions are. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. I see a question from Kim in the audience. Kim?
Okay, thank you, Charles, for the great presentation. My question is very simple. During the anti-Japanese, anti-fascist war, it's very clear that the Communist Party of China was the main protagonist in terms of bringing together a united front against fascism and unite the Chinese people of all classes and all walks against the Japanese fascists. Is in your mind, when you're giving this presentation, is there an equivalent party or group of people in Palestine that you think will be able to do the same kind of thing to foster a big united front against Israeli fascism? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's one where I think the parallels with the Chinese experience are where both the power of that analogy and its limits really come to the fore, because the position that the CPC was in was essentially as the only sort of major political force in China that was calling for, like overt military resistance to Japan throughout most of the 30s until 1937. And there was, there were some contingent circumstances that actually led to the formation of the United Front with the KMT, right? There's the Xi'an incident where some of Chiang Kai-shek's lieutenants actually like kidnapped him and forced him at gunpoint to stop the war on the communists and to join forces with them and turn their guns on the Japanese invaders instead. And depending on your theory of history, you may or may not see that contingent event as like a real kind of decisive point in of itself, right? You might think, okay, like even if that hadn't happened, they would have been forced into United Front anyway. But regardless, I think what has to be acknowledged is that it was fortuitous, right? And that the CPC itself didn't necessarily have the kind of territorial base and at the time the level of military parity with the KMT, which ruled the vast majority of Chinese territory that was outside Japanese occupation, right? To impose its will directly. And that's where the situation in Palestine with the Palestinian Authority, in many ways, I think even more of a nakedly collaborationist force with Zionist occupation than even Chiang Kai-shek at his most craven, in the early 30s vis-a-vis Japan, where that presents a major complication, right? Because you have really fragmented and partial territorial authority there, as well as a really suffocating repression of resistance in the West Bank. And then, of course, also the resistance in Gaza, while it has achieved certainly a level of visibility and primacy and centrality for both the cause of Palestine and for resistance as a strategy since October 7th. That hasn't really changed the reality of the ground in the West Bank either. And so ultimately to answer your specific question in a word, I think that it is not our place in the solidarity movement. It's not China's place as a broker. It's not the place of any force outside Palestine to dictate or even to pick out and identify and elevate a particular force, a particular resistance formation as like any kind of exact analog to the CPC when it comes to the question of resistance. But what we can do is shape the conditions, or what we should be pushing to do is to shape the conditions on the ground for Palestinian self-determination and genuine political sovereignty to assert themselves in a way where all of these forces can play their role in a democratic polity. And that's what I think the actual genuine advance represented by the Beijing Declaration could be if the space exists, right, to actualize it on the ground. So yeah, I don't know if that was like a satisfactory answer, but those are just sort of some of my thoughts on that question. And yeah, unfortunately, I do have to hop off pretty much at the hour, so I don't know if I can take any more questions. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, everyone, and to Megan, Jody, and the rest of the CODEPINK team for having me on.
Thank you so much, Charles. We appreciate you being here. You're brilliant. Keep up all the good work you're doing.
All right, right back at you. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.